So, this section of cognition refers to intelligence or process of intelligence testing. We'll talk about all of that. But before we go any further, it makes sense to get a definition of intelligence, right? And I will say to you that if you were to ask experts in the field, they would disagree on what intelligence is. So, your book's definition of intelligence is very broad strokes. And then you'll see some of the debates as we go. So, what is intelligence? Intelligence refers to the mental abilities that we need to select, adapt to, and to also shape our environments around us. So, it requires us to be able to profit from experience and be able to solve problems and use abstract reasoning and to solve whatever challenges of the day or goals we have in society. So there are different concepts of intelligence, right? So we're starting to see it's pretty broad. The pioneer that's most linked to intelligence is Alfred Binet. And Alfred Binet is considered the person who created the first uh, successful mental test or intelligence test. And it's important to understand that Binet was not the first person to talk about intelligence, but he was the first person to meaningfully measure it. And that's important. So, how did that happen? Well, it happened because Alfred Binet was working with the French ministry and he was hired to come up with an instrument that allowed him to separate out children who would profit from regular education classroom versus those who might need a special education classroom. And this was happening when France started to push education for all children. So, as the focus on education for children increased, so did the need to come up with a test to screen individuals who were equal to or on board with their peers versus those who were struggling. So, uh, he created this test, and from his test, he came up with something called a mental age. And the mental age referred to based on your performance on the test, roughly what your chronological age would be. Now, how does that work? When we have intelligence tests, we have something called a normative sample. And we give the test to thousands of people, and we come up with a bell shaped curve. And what he was able to say is if you got to answer 4, this is what the typical age would be for a person who could only get to question 4 versus a person who got to question 7. Their mental age would be higher and whatnot. And it was a rough measure of where you were relative to your peers. We have a much more sophisticated process today than they did back in Benet's time. But nevertheless, this was our first pass at creating an intelligence test, and it worked. So Alfred Binet and his colleague Simon published their revisions of the intelligence test in 1908, 1911, and then we start to see something remarkable happen. The test winds up being brought to the United States. And when it was brought to the United States, it was brought to 2 places. The first place it went to was Stanford University. And there was a gentleman at Stanford University who was interested in gifted children and their long-term, outcomes. So Lewis Terman was very much needing a test that could measure high levels of IQ. So he adapted the test. He modified Binet's instrument, added other questions, created more specific age norms and allowed the test to have a higher ceiling or an upper range that could go to teenagers and even adults. So that was a big change. And ultimately, that test becomes called the Stanford Binet test. And the Stanford Binet test is what we have today. It is one of the instruments we use to measure intelligence, right? So it is widely used. One of the nice things about the Stanford Binet test is it has sensitivity to lower IQ scores relative to others, and so its floor is lower and its ceiling is higher. So there are benefits to the Stanford Binet. And then there was added the Stern's formula for IQ. So if you ever hear IQ, it's actually a formula or a ratio, which is mental age divided by chronological age, and then we multiply it by 100. And the reason why we do that is because we're looking for a whole number, right? So if let's say you took the Stanford Binet test and I don't know, you got the age of a 4-year-old. So your mental age, as we talked about on a previous slide, was 4, but you're only 3 years old. So what you would do is you would do your mental age of 4 divided by your chronological age of 3. So 4 divided by 3 equals 1.33. But we didn't want a decimal, right? So we had to multiply it by 100. So 1.33 times 100 would give this child an IQ of 133, which ultimately would make that child a genius. But notice how we had the mental age, we had the chronological age, and we did a formula. Today, when we do IQ testing, we just plug in their raw score or how they performed on subcomponents, and it computes it for us. We don't have to use this more rudimentary formula. But I want you to know this formula because this was the genesis of IQ. Now, I said to you that Lewis Terman took this to Stanford University, right? But there were 2 major places it went. It also went to Ellis Island. And Ellis Island was a station where immigrants would come in on ship and then get processed. And the decision was whether to admit them, to detain them, or to reject entry to the country. And there was a gentleman by the name of Henry Goddard. And Goddard applied these IQ tests to new arrivals. And this is one of our early criticisms of bias in testing, was he administered an IQ test that was not culturally appropriate for those people who are coming. He also administered a test that was validated with an English-speaking sample to non-native English speakers. And his answer was, oh, well, we had a translator. The problem is that there are a lot of things that are lost in translation. And then, oh, yeah, people spent weeks at sea before they got here. So the idea of taking someone immediately off a boat and then assessing them to determine whether they are able to, be processed and enter into the U.S. society, there are a lot of problems with it. So there's a lot of controversy around the use of IQ testing historically. So there are linguistic issues, cultural issues. We're going to talk about some questions about racial bias shortly, and so forth. So we have the Alfred Binet and the Stanford Binet test. Now, generally, the Stanford-Binet test is looking at a person from a holistic point of view as having one unitary measure of intelligence. There is another person who talked about intelligence as your G, or your G plus S technically. So Spearman suggests that our intelligence is reflected by our G, or general abilities. But he did talk about an S as well, which is not on the slide, which is specific abilities. And why did Spearman focus on general intelligence? Well, these were the mental abilities that were pervasive, that were useful in everyday life in virtually every task. Whereas S stands for a specific, and it was these abilities that were S abilities were limited in how they showed up and when you needed them. So if we're looking for a competing definition of intelligence, we have the G. So Spearman's definition is G, which is a global or general intelligence factor. Now, there were other people who rejected the notion of a unitary intelligence, a singular measure. People like Howard Gardner at Harvard University argued that there was no singular intelligence. In fact, he proposed initially that there were 7 distinct intelligences. Now he's added an 8th and proposed a 9th since then, but his original proposition where there were 7 distinct intelligences. And the standard intelligence test doesn't reflect everything. So you have your verbal abilities and your mathematical abilities. Now, these are highly reflected in intelligence tests, but there were others, people who have gifted visual spatial skills. Maybe if you give that person a traditional IQ test, they would score average or perhaps even below average, but they're gifted in visual spatial skills. For example, an electrician, a carpenter, a construction worker, all would probably score very high on visual spatial skills. It isn't just the physicists who would score high. Then you have musical intelligence. These are people who are composers, or people who are songwriters, people like it's not just Bach and Chopin and Beethoven in classical music, it's every genre of music. You know, people like Kanye West, who, you know, is highly controversial, but is arguably very intelligent, right? So there's that musical intelligence. Then there's the interpersonal intelligence, other people. So a person who's very good at sales might score high in interpersonal realm. We have a person who's has intrapersonal understanding oneself skills. That might be a social worker, right? And so forth. Then we have a kinesthetic intelligence, which might be a dancer, right? So all of these abilities, you know, a lot of them are not reflected on a traditional intelligence test, which means that when we give a person an IQ score, we're not fully capturing their essence, right? So it's a strong critique against, you know, traditional IQ tests. However, one of the arguments against Gardner is that it violates the basic rule of the law of parsimony, which is the more simplistic explanation is oftentimes the most correct one. So every time you add a new intelligence, you're adding assumptions as well. So the more sub-intelligences, you have to assume that they're separate from all of the other. If they're distinct, they can't be connected. And in reality, some of these have overlap, right? So visual spatial skills and kinesthetic skills are both needed for athletes, right? Gymnasts, basketball players, etc. So they're not fully uh, distinct. And Gardner added more. So he added a eighth one called naturalistic intelligence, which is basic understanding of the natural world. So biologists and chemists and physicists and things like that. And then he proposed a ninth, as I said, which was more of an existential. So philosophers, theologians, etc. These are all um, additional forms of intelligence, and that he believed were different. So while I talk about Gardner, it's a highly controversial perspective. And then there's a whole host of other forms of intelligence that are not reflected on your cognitive test at all. So social intelligence, right? That's a term for being able to read the room and understand social situations and manage oneself appropriately for the social situation. And then you might have heard the term EQ, emotional intelligence, which is the ability to um, understand, express, and regulate one's own emotions. So, how do we assess intelligence, right? So, we talked about uh, the Stanford Binet test. However, I will tell you that David Wexler came up with a series of tests that actually do, in my opinion, an even better job than the Stanford Binet. And one of the things that David Wexler did was he took IQ tests and broke them down and said, okay, the content that's relevant in preschool years might not be the same kind of content that's relevant for school age children, and certainly not adults. So he divided into three different tests called the WIPSI, WISC, and WACE. And there's some overlap in the age ranges that they cover, but generally speaking, the WIPSI is from 2 to about 7 years old. The WISC goes from 6 to 16, and the WACE goes 16 plus all the way into late adulthood. So now, the truth is, according to Wexler and according to research, if you gave a 6-year-old the WIPSI, or you gave a 6-year-old the WISC, it wouldn't matter, right? Both tests would yield a very similar IQ because they're standardized tests, they're normed, they're validated. So you might say, well, if there are two tests with overlap, why would you even consider it? Well, think about this. Let's say you have a person you believe is super intelligent, might even be a genius. If you give them the WIPSI, they're going to be starting out with material that is overly easy, and they might get bored and may not perform according to potential because it just bored them. Similarly, if you have a person who you think might have some cognitive deficits and you use a test that starts at a level that's challenging, you might have a person quit prematurely and give up, right? So it's intentional that there's overlap on the various IQ tests. Okay. Now, another cool thing that Wexler did was he started to break intelligence down into verbal and nonverbal components, right? So, and if you're working in schools and you're dealing with people with language delays or perhaps autism spectrum disorder, if you only use a verbal test as the traditional tests were, you're going to underrepresent IQ. And sure enough, if you look, individuals with autism oftentimes have higher scores on performance-based subtests. So he also was able to separate out the linguistic versus the non-linguistic components. Now, keep in mind, any linguistic piece creates some kind of bias, right? Because the language we use and the meaning of words, the subtleties in language could skew performance. All right, so here's examples of some verbal skills. Now, these are not real questions on the IQ test. It's just an example. So information, right? So information is a subtest that taps into general information that's acquired. So who's the president of the United States? Well, you should be able to answer that. Or who was Martin Luther King, right? You should be able to answer that. That's general knowledge stuff. So that's information. Comprehension taps into how you can abstract and reason. So if you were to ask, what is the phrase to kill two birds with one stone metaphorically mean, right? It means to multitask and be more efficient. But that requires you to understand, social conventions. Arithmetic. How many 45-cent stamps can you buy with $1, right? Simple mathematical problems you should be able to do. So the correct answer would be 2, right? Because you can't buy a partial stamp. And then it goes on and on and on. So similarities tap into verbal reasoning. Now, some of these have different levels of correct answer. You have a 2-point answer, a 1-point answer, and a 0-point. 2-point is the most ideal answer. A 1-point is adequate, and 0 is they didn't get anything right. So if you were to ask in what way are an apple and a pear alike, well, the 2-point answer would be their fruit, right? A 1-point answer might be they both have stems, right? That is a similarity, but that's not the main similarity. Then we have vocabulary asking, well, what is this, that, or another, and they have to answer it. And then we have those memory tests, digit span, which I demonstrated in the previous video. So short-term memory and concentration, and then letter number sequencing, right? So sometimes we will see that people can sequence backwards better than forwards. And it's actually not uncommon with people with ADHD that they do better on digit span backwards. So if you repeat a number, you ask it, say, in reverse order, they tend to do better. Now, why is that? It forces concentration. On a regular digit span test or digit span forward, they might make careless mistakes because they're like, oh, this is easy. But if I say, okay, now I want you to do it in reverse order, it's going to force them to focus more. So that's verbal. Now you can see all of those answers are spoken. Now, if you have a person who has linguistic barriers or comes from another country, those verbal components are going to create noise. It's going to create data or errors in the data. The scores are going to be lower than they should be. So there are performance tests, right? So picture completion, putting puzzles together, digit symbol coding, and block design. There are a whole host of these to give you a sense so that we can keep it moving. If I give you this picture and I give you blocks, can you reproduce that image? Or can you put this dog puzzle together, object assembly? Or can you convert these symbols into numbers or vice versa? So all of these require you to be able to perform a task. You don't need to answer them verbally. So that allows people who are nonverbal or whatnot to show their IQ as well. So we talked about the Wechsler test. I do want to define the difference between an achievement test and an aptitude test as well. An achievement test is a form of a test that measures what you've already learned. An aptitude test is used to predict future performance or your capacity to learn. Not what you've already learned, but what your capacity is, your potential is. So that's an aptitude test. An IQ test is more aligned with an S, right? Because IQ is supposed to be relatively stable and it's supposed to be predictive of future outcomes. All right. So, what are some test requirements? Well, we have standardization, which means that before we use a test, we have to determine that it's reliable and valid. And then we have to have a large amount of data that serves as how we norm the test. So, what score is considered appropriate? What score is going to be a lower score? What score is going to be a higher score? So, we use something called a standardization group or a pre-tested group that we use as the comparison scores. Standardization also requires us to administer the test the same way to everyone. So while it involves a standardization group, it also involves how you administer the test. So then we have the question, is the test reliable and valid? Well, reliability, we said, refers to consistency of scores. Validity, we said, refers to accuracy. Does this test measure what it's supposed to? And there are two aspects of validity that are very important here. Content validity. So is the test truly measuring what it's supposed to, right? So the questions on the test, do they really measure IQ? And then criterion-oriented validity is, can we use the IQ test to predict an outcome? Now, there is a debate. Remember from developmental psychology, nature versus nurture. Well, nature, we're talking about heredity. Nurture, we're talking about environmental influences. So how do we apply that to IQ? Well, we see that the more similar you are in genetics, the more similar your IQ score is. So the correlation or similarity between identical twins is stronger than fraternal twins, and fraternal twins stronger than siblings, and siblings stronger than unrelated individuals. So the more genetically similar you are, the more similar your IQ score is, right? And even when we do adoption studies, there is more of a similarity to biological parents relative to adoptive parents. So that is the role of genetics and heredity. But there are a whole host of environmental factors as well. So if you're raised in an environment that has limited enrichedness, meaning there aren't books, there aren't puzzles, there aren't blocks, well, that child's environment is going to predispose them to perform poorer than their peers. Now, we do have early intervention, we do have pre-K and UPK. All of these things are designed to help level the playing field, but that doesn't mean that there aren't environmental deficits that are going to make one person perform poorer on an IQ test than another. And we also see, if we were to take a specific grade, the people who are older in a grade tend to perform higher than their younger counterparts. So there's an age-related bias, there's an environmental-related bias, and so forth. Now, when it comes to ethnic differences, there's also a controversy here, right? Because the data suggests that African Americans and Hispanic individuals perform significantly lower relative to Caucasian and Asians. Now, it's about one standard deviation difference. That is huge. But if we were to apply the content of the test, right? The content of the test taps into middle class white America. So a lot of the questions you could criticize as having a bias towards ethnic or against ethnic minorities. So it's a problem we have. And then gender differences, we see that there are differences between males and females. And long story short is males tend to do better with math and spatial reasoning, and women tend to do better with verbal abilities, right? So when it comes to IQ, there's also some biases in the test related to gender. And Claude Steele talked about this concept called stereotype threat, which is knowing a stereotype about one's own group affects one's performance. You don't even have to believe this stereotype, but if this stereotype is triggered, it's going to affect your performance. So, interesting to note that Claude Steele did an IQ study comparing Caucasians and African Americans, and the test administrator was Caucasian, and other test administrators were African American. When a Caucasian administrator give a test to an African American testee, right? They tend to perform lower than if the administrator is African American. And the reason is, even if a person doesn't believe the stereotype, it's primed by, okay, here's a measure of my IQ. Same thing with males and females, right? So females, there's a stereotype linked to mathematics that females aren't good at math, which is not true. But Claude Steele did a study where males and females were administered like high-level math quiz, and in one group, they were told this is just a fun worksheet, do the best you can. And in another group, they were told this is a measure of your mathematical abilities. And sure enough, in the group that they were told it's a measure of mathematical abilities, women performed poorer. In the group that it was just a fun problem, males and females performed equally. Now, Claude Steele did this with math majors, so everybody is good at math in this sample. But priming it against a stereotype, people perform poorer. And that is our lecture. That's the content for test 3. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to take attendance, and then we'll go from there.